Last year, right about this time, we reviewed the XPS 13 from Dell. At the time, it was getting a lot of praise for its clean design, great performance, and its Infinity Edge display. That refers to the super thin bezel that allowed Dell to create the world's smallest 13-inch laptop. Well, 13 inches just isn't enough for some people, so they've taken the design from the 13 and pumped it up to 15.6 inches. So, with a 4K display, a Core i7, and GTX 960M inside, is the XPS 15 the Windows notebook to rule them all? Let's find out. Now, the XPS 13 is sort of geared towards business professional types. It's super compact, it's light, it's got a long-lasting battery. The XPS 15, on the other hand, depending on which configuration you've got, will be much more attractive to content creators. It's smaller compared to other laptops in its class, but still manages to fit a 15.6-inch 4K touch-enabled display. There's plenty of I/O ports incorporated in the very clean design, and overall, it was a joy to do this review, except for some mildly irritating technical issues that I'll get into later on. For now, let's take a tour, shall we? The overall aesthetic remains largely unchanged from the XPS 13, with blasted aluminum on the top and bottom, lending an attractive tapering look when viewed from the side. The device's height ranges from 11 to 17 millimeters, width is 357 millimeters, depth is 235 millimeters, and this model weighs 4.4 pounds, although that will vary depending on which configuration you get. The underside has two long raised rubber feet that slightly elevate the bottom of the machine so air can reach the intake and exhaust vents. A small plate sits in the center of the bottom, which can be flipped back to see the serial number and things of that nature. Also on the bottom, we see the two sort of front-facing speakers, which I found to have a pretty impressively full sound for a laptop. My wife preferred them to her MacBook, and she's an Apple fanatic, so... Opening the lid is a bit too difficult, in my opinion. You pretty much need two hands to do it. However, the plus side of that is that the hinge is super sturdy, with no wobble at all as you type. We see that beautiful display I was talking about, so here are the full specs. It's a 3840 by 2160, IGZO, IPS, touch-enabled, 60 Hz, with 350 nit brightness, 100% Adobe RGB accuracy, and covered by Gorilla Glass NBT. Dell has included a pretty handy color managing program that allows you to switch between color profiles and customize your own as well. At 4K, everything looks amazingly sharp, but it also means you're going to have to fiddle with the resolution in some other programs. More on that later. Underneath the display, you have a decent quality 720p webcam with dual mics, since there's no room at the top, thanks to the nearly non-existent bezel. Heading on down to the palm rest area, we again see very pretty carbon fiber, covered with a soft touch finish that I must say is very pleasing to rest my hands upon. The keyboard is nothing special, but it's more than adequate for typing for extended periods. I wrote this whole review on it. There's a pleasantly distinct actuation point, but a somewhat unpleasantly mushy bottom. It's got 3 levels of backlight, although one of those is off, so it's actually 2. Now, the touchpad was very pleasant to use. It's glass, and tracking the cursor around is super smooth. I wouldn't say it's quite as good as the trackpads on MacBooks, but probably the best one I've tried on a Windows laptop, that's for sure. Onwards to the ports! On the right side, we've got a full-size SD card slot, USB 3.0, a push-button light-up battery indicator, and a Kensington lock. On the other side, you've got your charging port, another full-size USB 3, HDMI, USB Type-C with Thunderbolt 3 and all of the goodness that entails, and an audio jack. Dell also sent us this super handy USB 3 adapter that sports another USB, HDMI, VGA, and Ethernet port, but if you want one of those, you're going to have to pick one up for around $70, last I checked. Now on the inside, this is where it gets interesting, and it's what matters most. Configurations range from a Core i3 to i7, 8 to 32 gigs of memory, 1080p to 4K, touch or non-touch, 500 gig hard drive, all the way up to a 1 terabyte PCIe SSD. So there's a big range available. The one we have, however, is sort of in the middle. We've got an Intel Core i7 6700HQ, 16 gigs of DDR4 memory, a 512 gig Samsung 951 NVMe PCIe SSD, although we ended up with 467 gigs of usable space, an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 960M with 2 gigs of VRAM, an 84 watt-hour battery, and of course, the 4K touch-enabled display. We've already talked about that. Okay, gone over it. Well, Keys, you might say, that sounds like some pretty ballin' specs. And you would be right, mystery viewer. The i7 and 16 gigabytes of RAM ensured super smooth performance in normal applications like web browsing and playing videos, and the GTX 960M meant playing games was very much possible. Although the XPS 15 has a 4K screen, which means I obviously had to turn the resolution down to get playable frame rates in Rocket League, Star Wars Battlefront, and Rainbow Six Siege. I did load up Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, and Audition, and they seem to perform very admirably, with no real slowdowns, although there was some tearing in Adobe Premiere when I was zooming in and out of the timeline and scrubbing back and forth pretty fast, but nothing that would hinder workflow. If you're editing 4K content, the screen will definitely be A+, and yeah, it's pretty good. So, on to the benchmarks. First off, in Cinebench, we got a pretty pleasing 70.95 in OpenGL and 627 for the CPU test. Not bad. Skylake processors focused more on efficiency improvements than raw power, so while this won't have crazy performance boosts over previous Gen i7s, you should see overall battery life improve. For GPU tests, we got 3707 in Firestrike and 11248 in Skydiver, showing the XPS 15 performing slightly above the average score for a gaming laptop, but not quite enough to get the VR-ready recommendation. Okay, onto the actual games. But before that, a note about resolutions. The display is a 3840 by 2160 panel, but you can set it to various resolutions below that, obviously, like any Windows machine, including 1920 by 1080p, but there's no option for 2560 by 1440, a 16 by 9 resolution that's sort of halfway between 1080p and 4K. There's only 2048 by 1152, which is also 16 by 9, but only slightly higher than 1080p. If you want to run in 1440p, you'll have to go through the NVIDIA control panel and set a custom resolution, but I didn't fiddle around with that because, 1080p looks fine to me for gaming on a 15.6-inch panel. So I tested these three games at 1080p, 2048 by 1152, and 4K. Now, I played Rocket League on this thing constantly, and it didn't let me down. It wasn't as buttery smooth as playing on desktop, obviously, with a higher refresh rate monitor, but the XPS 15 definitely wasn't hurting for performance in that regard. At 1080p and high settings, it averaged 62 frames per second, 50 FPS at 1152p, and 22 FPS at 4K, so that's unplayable. On medium settings, Battlefront got an average of 80 FPS at 1080, 65 at 1152, and just 18 at 4K, a much wider range. And Rainbow Six Siege at medium settings got 60 at 1080, 54 at 1152, and 16 at 4K. All that to state the obvious, just because you've got a 4K panel doesn't mean you should game at 4K. But the XPS 15, despite not really being positioned as a gaming laptop, performed quite admirably. It didn't get super hot either. The fan system seems to do its job quite well, especially when it's placed on a hard surface and not on a blanket like when I played Rocket League in bed all the time. Now, I have been giving this thing a pretty glowing recommendation, it seems like, but there are a couple gripes I have with this laptop. One of which is that there seems to be some issues with the device recognizing some of its own hardware at times. Occasionally, when I restart it, Wi-Fi just won't be there. Not even an option to enable or disable. Windows Device Manager doesn't even detect that there is a wireless adapter when this happens. This is solved by shutting the system down and starting up again, not restarting. The problem will keep showing up until you specifically shut down and start back up. And other times the trackpad wouldn't register, which was also solved by shutting down. I had to fiddle with the keyboard. I talked to Dell during my review and they were very helpful. They suggested I update the BIOS and drivers for the network adapter, but that didn't actually solve the problem. Looking online, I can see other users encountering the same problem, so hopefully Dell figures out the situation soon. Once you restart, the thing runs like a dream. It's just disappointing to use a brand new, fancy, carbon fiber looking thing and have it crap out like that. Now, other than those minor issues I had, I'd say the XPS 15 is a very compelling product. Where everyone is going for 2-in-1s and hybrids, Dell has created what is most likely the best Windows laptop on the market right now that also doesn't happen to look like a MacBook clone. Windows notebooks have come a long way, and if we continue to see devices like this, I think we're gonna do just fine. They could maybe bring the price down a little bit, though. That always helps. If you want more information on the Dell XPS 15, go ahead and click this link, either here or there, or the one in the description. And also, what do you guys think of this laptop? That was a run-on sentence. Is the Infinity Edge display fancy enough to make you consider it? Leave a comment below. Alright, that's it for this episode of Unpacked, guys. Thanks for watching. Click here to watch more videos, follow us on social media over here, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this from NCIX.